I planned the perfect ambush for my wife and her lover at the company party. The night was orchestrated like a meticulously choreographed show, where every detail had been thought out to unmask the betrayal that had been consuming me for weeks. The room was packed, full of fake smiles, clinking glasses and superficial conversations. But for me, that party wasn't about celebration. It was the stage where the truth would explode in front of everyone present, tearing masks and revealing secrets that should have remained buried. As I walked among the guests, greeting familiar faces and forcing a controlled smile, my gaze stayed fixed on her. Beautiful, smiling, radiant as always. She seemed to float around the room, as if nothing could touch her perfection. But I knew. I knew what was hiding behind that sparkle in her eyes and that impeccable dress. I knew because I had seen it with my own eyes. I had proof, messages, photos, traces of perfume on shirts that should never have been touched. The idea of exposing it in front of everyone gnawed at me and, at the same time, fed me. I held on to the pain to turn despair into a plan. I spent sleepless nights putting together the video, gathering every piece of evidence, every detail that would make it impossible to deny. I had reserved the screen, programmed the presentation and prepared the speech. They would have nowhere to run. The shame would be public, but the pain would be mine alone. The muffled sound of conversations mixed with the ambient music as the head of the company took the stage to begin the thanks and announcement of promotions. My fingers tightened around the glass of whiskey, and my breathing quickened as the moment approached. She was there in front, next to him, so close that it was impossible to ignore the complicity in her gestures. A light touch on the arm, a discreet smile, a stolen look when they thought no one was watching. They didn't know that someone was always watching. My heart hammered in my chest as I walked toward the screen control booth. The technician gave me a thumbs up, and I nodded. The video was loaded. When the boss asked everyone's attention for the special moment, prepared to close the night, the room fell into silence. The lights dimmed, and the screen lit up. At the beginning, happy images appeared, photos of the year's achievements and funny moments of the team. Laughter echoed through the room, but I knew it would soon be replaced by shock and outrage. I took a deep breath. It was now. The first scene started rolling. She and him, together in a cafe, laughing like teenagers in love. Murmurs began to spread. Then, images emerged of the two leaving a cheap motel, her holding his hand as if it were the most natural thing in the world. A collective sigh took over the room. And then, the final recording, the two kissing in the company's parking lot, in broad daylight. I heard the sound of glass shattering. Someone had dropped a glass. She tried to run, but the crowd blocked her way. He remained motionless, pale, unresponsive. I approached her slowly, savoring the moment when I would finally look into her eyes and say everything that needed to be said. "Do you want to explain this to everyone or should I continue?" My voice was firmer than I expected. She opened her mouth, but no words came out. Her eyes were full of panic, and I saw the exact moment she realized there was no escape. The lover, on the other hand, stepped forward, trying to regain control of the situation. "This is an invasion of privacy. You can't do that." Invasion of privacy? My laugh echoed throughout the room. Privacy is what you threw away when you decided to use my marriage as a hobby. Silence spread like poison. I could feel the judgment in the eyes of every person there. But, before anyone could react, a voice rose from the back of the room. It was a woman. Young man, with tears in his eyes and an expression of repressed anger. "He's married," she said, pointing to her lover. The hall erupted in murmurs. The tension was unbearable. He tried to deny it, shaking his head, but the woman was already advancing towards him. "I'm his wife," she continued, her voice shaking. "And you destroyed our home." My wife turned to me, her eyes full of pleading, but I just walked away. She was now cornered, surrounded by disapproving looks and faces that had previously smiled at her. And the worst was yet to come. As the woman confronted her lover, revealing intimate details of their marriage, an even greater truth was about to be unearthed. A truth that could change everything I thought I knew about that betrayal. At that moment, as the room buzzed with tensions and revelations, I realized that the night was far from over. And, even with everything I had discovered so far, something told me that the final blow was yet to come. Welcome to the channel where the truth about cheating is exposed bluntly. Here, we believe that loyalty and respect are the basis of any relationship, and we never support or romanticize betrayal. The stories told are fictional, but they carry powerful lessons about how disloyalty can destroy lives, corrupt trust and leave deep scars. Get ready to dive into an intense narrative, full of twists, raw emotions and painful truths. Settle in. The shocking story you are about to hear begins now. The room was impeccable, decorated with golden lights and floral arrangements carefully positioned on round tables covered with white tablecloths. The bar in the background sparkled with bottles lined up on illuminated shelves, and the soft sound of jazz filled the room as guests arrived and took their seats. It was a special night for the company, a celebration of the year's achievements and, for many, an opportunity to strengthen ties, show confidence and, perhaps, impress superiors. Among the guests, Michael stood out. In a well-fitting dark suit, he walked around the room greeting colleagues with firmness and a smile that seemed easy to those observing from afar, but those who knew him knew that there was something unsettling behind that attentive look. Beside him, Emily glided through the room with the elegance that always attracted attention. The black dress with thin straps hugged her body, highlighting her impeccable silhouette. Her blonde hair fell in soft waves over her shoulders and her blue eyes seemed to sparkle under the lights. Emily was the kind of woman who effortlessly charmed, which made it difficult for anyone to imagine her carrying worries or insecurities. But Michael knew. He knew every nuance of that smile and noticed, even in the smallest gestures, when she was uncomfortable or anxious. That night, however, he wasn't sure what was behind the exaggerated shine in her eyes. Michael and Emily had been together for 10 years. He remembered the day he first saw her, rushing into the cafe near the office where he worked. At the time, Michael was just an intern trying to prove himself, while Emily was already a promising young woman in the field of marketing. She bumped into him while trying to get her coffee and dropped the documents she was holding. Michael bent down to help her, and in that brief moment when their eyes met, something clicked. It wasn't an epic encounter, but it was the beginning of something that seemed destined to grow. The relationship evolved quickly. Emily had ambition and charm, Michael, determination and a sense of protection that attracted her. They balanced each other in ways that made people comment on how much they seemed made to be together. Before long, they were sharing an apartment and, a year later, they were married in an intimate ceremony on the beach. The first years were intense and passionate, full of shared trips, plans and dreams. But, as with many couples, routine began to creep in. Michael threw himself into his work, seeking promotions and recognition, while Emily grew in her career, gaining admirers and building an impeccable image within the company. In recent months, however, something seemed to have changed. Michael noticed the small changes in Emily's behavior, discreet phone calls, hastily answered messages, and exaggerated care with her appearance even for casual work meetings. He tried to shake off suspicions, telling himself it was just accumulated stress, but an uneasiness began to grow in his chest. He observed her more closely, analyzing her gestures and reactions, looking for something he perhaps didn't want to find. Emily, on the other hand, felt pressured. She knew that Michael was distant, too involved in work, and that made her feel alone at many times. Conversations between them had become short and matter-of-fact, with rare moments of genuine connection. She wondered if the love she felt for him was still enough to sustain their relationship or if they were just stuck in a routine that was too comfortable to abandon. That night, as Emily mingled with her classmates, laughing and exchanging greetings, Michael felt the weight of the distance between them. He watched her every move, capturing details that might be insignificant to anyone else, but to him were like pieces of a puzzle that didn't fit together. When she laughed at something the man next to her said, Michael felt his stomach turn. It wasn't the laughter itself, but the way she touched her colleague's arm while laughing, a quick gesture but intimate enough to awaken a new wave of suspicion. He turned away from the bar and walked towards the stage, where the opening speech was about to begin. The host's words echoed throughout the room, but Michael barely heard them. His mind was too busy with the thoughts he had been trying to suppress for weeks. He wondered when exactly things started to fall apart. Maybe it was on Emily's last work trips or on those nights when she arrived late and claimed to be finishing important campaigns. Maybe it was the first time he noticed the smell of a perfume that wasn't hers clinging to the collar of her coat. Emily, in turn, kept the smile on her face, but felt the weight of Michael's gaze crossing her. She knew he was watching. I always knew that Michael was attentive and that, sooner or later, he would ask questions. But that night, she refused to think about it. I was determined to enjoy the event and keep up appearances. After all, it was what he had always done best. As the speeches continued and the toasts were made, the tension between them increased. Michael remained close, but at the same time distant, as if he was waiting for the right moment to act. Emily, on the other hand, avoided prolonged eye contact, focusing on keeping conversations light and carefree. When the music started and the couple started dancing, Michael finally approached her. He held out his hand, and she hesitated for a second before taking it. As they danced, their bodies close but their minds far apart, Michael looked into her eyes and asked softly if there was anything she would like to say. Emily froze for a moment before smiling and shaking her head. The dancing continued, but the silence between them was deafening. Michael felt the weight of the unspoken words, and Emily tried to maintain her composure as the lump in her throat tightened. They were a couple admired by many, but there, in the middle of that dance floor, they were more distant than they had ever been. The night progressed, and the clock marked the approach of the moment Michael had planned. The room was buzzing with laughter and conversation, but to him, every second seemed to drag by in slow motion. Emily, in turn, began to feel an uneasiness growing within her, as if she sensed that something was about to happen. She looked around, looking for signs of normality, but everything seemed a little out of place. Michael knew there was no going back. The plan was in motion, and soon, the masks would come off. But as he waited for the decisive moment, he couldn't help but wonder, was he really prepared to face everything that came after? Michael spent the days following the company party trapped in thoughts that came and went like violent waves. The images of that night continued to echo in his mind, the discreet smiles, the looks that he could no longer ignore, Emily's hurried excuses to get away for a few minutes here and there. He tried to find logic in it all, some reasonable explanation that would dispel the growing sense of betrayal that was eating away every bit of his sanity. But instead of answers, he found more questions. Emily looked the same over the next few days. Attentive, concerned about household chores, his work routine and even his well-being, which only made him more restless. She was more affectionate than usual, closer, but something about the touches and kisses seemed rehearsed. Michael began to notice details that had previously gone unnoticed. The messages on her cell phone that she always deleted, the last-minute appointments that came up without warning, the calls that ended abruptly when he entered the room. He felt the weight of distrust growing every day, and yet he clung to the hope that he was wrong. One night, while Emily was sleeping soundly next to him, Michael silently got up and took her cell phone, something he had never done before. His hands shook as he typed in the password he already knew, but had never dared to use. His heart was beating so hard that he feared waking her up. He scrolled through messages, photos, apps. Nothing. At first it looked too clean, like it had been carefully erased, but then it found what it shouldn't have. An archived email, short but direct. I can't wait to see you again. At the same time as always. I need you. He reread those words several times, hoping that they would somehow change their meaning. But they remained the same, sharp and raw. When he returned to bed, he lay next to Emily for hours, staring at the ceiling as the words echoed in his mind. Over the next few days, Michael struggled to remain calm. He needed to be sure, he needed more proof before he acted. He hired a private investigator, something he never imagined he would do, but at that moment it seemed like his only option. The following weeks were a test of his patience. He maintained the routine, smiled at the right moments, pretended not to notice Emily's delays, long showers and changed clothes before even returning home. Deep down, I hoped that I was mistaken, that the messages were misinterpreted, that it was all just paranoia fueled by insecurities. But the evidence began to arrive. Photos of her getting into a car that wasn't his. Images of her leaving an office building accompanied by someone Michael immediately recognized. It was one of her colleagues from the company, the same man who had been by her side during the party, the one who made Michael's stomach tighten. Confirmation came like a punch in the chest. Michael felt the world crashing down around him. The images were there, undeniable, and yet he still couldn't accept them. He remembered all the times he defended Emily, the nights he fought to believe that it was just tiredness or the stress of work that kept them apart. Now it all seemed like a carefully constructed lie. The investigator delivered a complete dossier, including times, locations and even recovered messages. Michael spent hours analyzing every detail, every image, trying to find something that could ease the impact, but everything only made the pain worse. Anger grew silently, accompanied by a feeling of humiliation that he couldn't control. He remembered the party again, the sparkle in her eyes, the way she moved around the room without fear, as if she could never be discovered. Michael knew he couldn't confront her without losing control, and so he planned. He didn't just want to expose her, he wanted her to feel the weight of the choices she made, to understand the impact of what she had destroyed. That night, while Emily took a shower, Michael sat in his office and began gathering files. He selected the most compromising photos and put together a video. It wasn't easy to watch the footage over and over again, but he needed to prepare, he needed to make sure every detail was perfect. When he finished, he stared at the computer screen for a long time, feeling a mixture of triumph and despair. The week passed slowly, and Emily seemed more and more distant. Michael noticed the avoided looks, the hurried kisses, the moments when she was lost in her own thoughts. He pretended not to notice, maintained his routine and continued acting as if nothing had changed. But inside, her every smile fueled the decision to expose her. The night of the company's next event, Michael was ready. Emily looked radiant, as always. She wore a red dress that he didn't remember ever seeing before. When he asked if it was new, she smiled and said she had bought it for the occasion. Michael nodded, keeping the tightness in his chest to himself. In the ballroom, Emily circulated among the guests with the same grace as always, and Michael watched her from afar. He noticed when she met her colleague, the same man in the photos, and exchanged quick glances. Michael looked away, not because it hurt, but because he needed to maintain control. When it was time for the night's main announcement, Michael went to the control booth and handed the video to the technician in charge. He watched from afar as the lights dimmed and the screen came on. At first, the images were neutral, relaxed moments of the team, photos from corporate trips and past parties. But then, the transition was abrupt. Emily appeared on the screen. First, leaving a cafe with a colleague. Then getting into his car. Voices began to rise in the hall. The final scene showed the two in a hotel room, smiling and exchanging kisses. The hall fell into a heavy silence. Emily was pale, her wide eyes fixed on the screen. The colleague next to her tried to walk away, but people started whispering and pointing. Michael took a few steps towards Emily, and she finally turned to him, tears forming in her eyes. She tried to speak, but he raised his hand, cutting her off before she could say anything. Michael felt the weight of betrayal shift into something darker. He looked at Emily one last time before turning away and leaving the room. But as I walked through the door, I knew this wasn't over yet. He still needed to face the secret that was about to be revealed. The hall remained silent, but the echo of the images that had just been displayed on the screen still hung in the air like distant thunder. Emily was still, her eyes locked on Michael, but he couldn't hold her gaze. Humiliation hung over everyone present like a suffocating weight. The murmurs grew in volume, as if the initial shock was beginning to be replaced by judgment and speculation. The lover, who until that moment had remained by Emily's side, took a step back, as if trying to free himself from her and the entire situation. Michael felt the urge to confront him, but something deeper and darker kept him paralyzed. Emily finally took a step forward, her eyes full of tears and her hands shaking, reaching towards him, as if a touch could erase the damage already done. Michael backed away, and the distance between them seemed greater than ever. Emily tried to speak, but her voice broke. When he finally did, the sound was low, fragile, almost a whisper. She begged him to listen, to give her a chance to explain. He laughed, but the laugh was bitter, filled with hurt and disbelief. Emily kept talking, stumbling over her words, saying that nothing was as it seemed, that he needed to hear the whole story before condemning her. Michael interrupted her, his voice finally exploding into the room, cutting through the air like a blade. He demanded to know how long this had been happening, how many lies she had told, how many times she had looked into his eyes and lied without hesitation. Emily cried, but Michael didn't feel sorry. He felt anger, betrayal, and overwhelming despair. The lover tried to intervene, but Michael silenced him with a sharp look. He didn't need to hear anything from that man. The only person that mattered at that moment was Emily, and she had a lot of explaining to do. Emily wiped her tears with the back of her hands, taking a deep breath before she began to speak. He said he had no excuses for what he did, but that there was more than he knew, something that would change everything. Michael shook his head, tired of the half-truths and empty promises, but something in her expression made him stop. She was terrified, but not just because of what had just happened. There was something deeper, a fear that transcended the public shame he faced. Emily swallowed hard before continuing. She said her lover was not just a colleague, but someone who was part of her past, someone Michael didn't know existed. Michael felt his stomach sink. He demanded more explanation, and Emily finally confessed. She revealed that she knew the man long before she met Michael. They had a relationship in the past, something that ended abruptly when she discovered he was married. At the time, she promised never to see him again, but he reappeared years later, claiming to be divorced and sorry for everything he had done. Michael interrupted her, asking why it mattered now, why she was bringing up an old relationship to justify a present betrayal. Emily hesitated, and it was at that moment that Michael realized the worst was yet to come. She lowered her head before finally saying the words he never expected to hear. The man was not only part of her past, but the father of a child she had hidden all those years. The room seemed to spin around Michael. He was left breathless, as if the ground had been ripped from beneath his feet. Emily continued talking, explaining that she got pregnant shortly before meeting Michael, but that she never told him because the man abandoned her when he found out about the pregnancy. She raised her son alone for the first few years, until she met Michael, who made her feel like she could start over, leave everything behind. Over time, she believed she could erase that chapter of her life, hide the past and move on as if nothing had happened. But the man returned, and with him came the threat of destroying everything she had built. He didn't just want a reunion, he wanted money, control, and eventually resumed the relationship under the promise of keeping the secret safe. Emily cried as she told how she felt trapped, afraid of losing Michael, of destroying the life they had built together. She said she gave in to the blackmail, but that she never planned to cheat on Michael, she just didn't know how to get out of the situation. Michael felt her words piercing his mind like needles. He tried to process everything he heard, but each detail seemed more devastating than the last. The betrayal had been painful enough, but the secret about his son was like a final blow. He looked at Emily, but he no longer saw the same woman he had married. She was there, in front of him, but she looked like a stranger. Emily moved closer, trying to touch him, but Michael backed away again. He asked her why she never trusted him, why she chose to carry that burden alone, and worse, why she let it turn into something so destructive. Emily tried to justify it, saying she was afraid of losing him, but Michael couldn't accept it. He felt as if everything in his life had been a lie, as if the love they shared had been built on quicksand. The lover, who had remained silent until then, tried to intervene again, saying that Emily just wanted to protect her son, that he had pressured and manipulated the situation. Michael advanced on him, holding him by the collar of his shirt, and for a moment, it seemed as if his anger would explode into violence. But then Michael released him, taking a step back and taking a deep breath. He didn't want to lose control. Emily begged him not to leave, to give her a chance to make things right. But Michael was no longer sure if there was anything that could be fixed. He felt tears burning his eyes, but he refused to let them fall. He turned and left the room, leaving Emily surrounded by judgmental looks and the weight of her choices. As he walked outside, Michael felt the pain give way to silent determination. He knew it didn't end there. There were still difficult decisions to be made, conversations to be had, and most of all, an uncertain future awaiting him. But at that moment, he just wanted to breathe, get away from the chaos and try to understand how his life had gotten to this point. Michael walked aimlessly down the sidewalk, the cold night air biting into his skin as his mind raced with Emily's words still resonating. The muffled noise of the party music gradually disappeared, giving way to the sound of one's own footsteps echoing in the void. The deserted street seemed to reflect the feeling of loneliness that came over him. Every word Emily spoke spun around in her head, mixing with the images from the video and the revelations that turned her life into ruins. He stopped next to a bench in the nearby park and sat down, feeling his legs finally give way under the weight of the shock. The phone vibrated in his pocket, but he ignored it. I knew it was Emily. He could almost hear her voice pleading on the other side, trying to weave the words into justifications that he could no longer accept. Her face, full of tears and despair, came back in flashes. The love he had dedicated for years seemed to crumble, giving way to a void he didn't know how to fill. He ran his hands over his face, feeling the heat of the tears that finally escaped, and took a deep breath. The minutes dragged by until the sound of footsteps brought him back. He looked up and saw Emily, without the coat she was wearing before, walking quickly towards him. She was panting, as if she had run there. When she stopped in front of him, there was a mix of fear and urgency in her eyes. "Please listen to me," she said, her voice trembling but firm. Michael looked at her for a long moment before responding. "I've heard everything." Emily shook her head, tears glistening in the streetlight. "No, you heard part of it. You heard enough to hate me, but not enough to understand. I'm not asking for forgiveness now, I'm just asking you to listen to what I still need to say." Michael crossed his arms and looked away, but remained silent, allowing her to continue. "I never planned to hide anything from you. At first, I just wanted to forget. He left me when I needed it most, and I did everything on my own. When you showed up, I thought I had a chance to start over. I wanted to put it behind me, but fear stopped me from telling her. I was afraid that you would look at me differently, that you would see me as broken." He turned to her, his gaze filled with hurt. "And you thought hiding a child was better? That building an entire life with me based on secrets would be the solution? Do you have any idea what that sounds like?" Emily took a step forward, her voice breaking. "I know. I know how it sounds, but I was desperate. And then he came back. He found out where I worked, showed up at the company and started threatening me. He said he was going to tell everything, that he was going to take my son away from me. I didn't know what to do. He promised he only wanted a second chance, but each encounter was blackmail in disguise. I was afraid of losing you and losing my son." Michael clenched his fists. "And you chose to sleep with him? Was this part of the plan?" Emily shuddered at the accusation. "It wasn't like that. I was so desperate to keep everything intact that I made horrible choices. I gave in to the pressure, but every moment was a mistake I knew I couldn't undo. Michael stood up, running his hands through his hair, walking from side to side. You destroyed everything. All. Emily approached, her eyes pleading for a trace of compassion. I know. But I never stopped loving you. Never. He laughed, but the laugh was bitter. Love? Do you call this love? She took another step, this time taking his arm. I called it survival. Maybe I lost myself in the process, but I was trying to protect you and the life we built. Michael pulled his arm away. What about the boy? The son you hid? Where is he now? Emily hesitated, and Michael felt his stomach drop. He doesn't know anything. He thinks you're his father. Michael's world seemed to stop. The words echoed with such force that he had to sit down again. He looked at Emily as if he couldn't recognize her. How could you do that? Emily knelt in front of him, holding his hands even when he tried to pull them away. Because you were the only father he ever knew. Because you were the man I wanted him to admire. I know I was wrong not to tell you before, but I was afraid of losing everything. Michael pulled his hands away and stood up. I've already lost everything. Emily remained on her knees, crying as he walked away once again. But this time, she didn't follow him. She stood there, watching him disappear into the darkness, feeling that perhaps this was the last time she would see him. Michael wandered through the night until he found a hotel. He went in, paid cash and went up to his room, where he finally allowed himself to break down. The tears came in waves, mixed with anger and pain. He didn't know how to face the future or even how to return home. The next day, reality knocked on the door. He picked up his phone and saw dozens of messages from Emily and missed calls. He ignored them all. But the name that appeared on the screen next made him freeze. It was from the lawyer he had hired to handle the legal aspects of the situation. I need to find you. It's urgent. Michael agreed, and an hour later he was sitting in a cold office, listening to words that only added to the pain. Emily's lover had been arrested that morning. The reason? Extortion, fraud and theft. He was using Emily to launder money through the company. Michael felt his throat go dry. Did Emily know that? The lawyer shook his head. There is no evidence that she knew. It seemed she was manipulated too. The news brought bitter relief. But the weight of what came next was still crushing. The secret had been revealed, but the consequences were just beginning. Michael stood in the lawyer's office, staring at the pile of documents on the table as if they were physical weights on his shoulders. The words about extortion and manipulation still echoed in his mind, but the shock was no longer enough to drown them out. He felt drained, as if he had run an emotional marathon and lost his breath halfway through. The pieces of the puzzle began to fall into place, but each new revelation brought with it a tighter knot in my chest. The information that Emily had also been used, that perhaps she wasn't as guilty as he believed, only further complicated the feelings battling within him. As the lawyer explained the next legal steps, Michael could barely pay attention. The firm, objective voice in front of him seemed distant, muffled by the sound of his own breathing. The image of Emily kneeling on the sidewalk, begging for a chance to be heard, was still vivid in his memory, and he hated himself for still having feelings for her, even after everything. He tried to focus on the words coming to him, but the weight of emotional confusion made it impossible to organize his thoughts. When he finally left the office, he felt the cold air hit his face and took a deep breath, as if he only realized at that moment that he was suffocating. He didn't come home. Instead, he drove aimlessly, passing familiar streets that now seemed strange, almost unreal. Emily's face kept appearing in his mind, accompanied by memories of happy times, shared laughter, and broken promises. Each memory was a blow, a reminder of what they had lost. When the phone rang, he didn't need to look to know who it was. Emily's number was already burned into his memory, but this time he answered. Her voice was weak, barely audible, and he realized she had been crying. She asked where he was, but he ignored the question and cut the subject short, saying he needed time. Emily begged to see him, saying that her son was asking for him, that he didn't understand what was happening. Michael closed his eyes, feeling the impact of the words, and said he didn't know if he was ready to face that yet. Emily begged him once again, saying she couldn't do this alone, that she needed him now more than ever. He hung up without answering, feeling guilt mixed with anger. The image of the boy appeared in his mind, a boy who always believed he was his father. Michael felt his hands shaking on the steering wheel. He thought of all the times he was there for the boy, teaching him to ride a bike, helping him with homework and holding his hand in difficult times. Now, everything seemed like a lie, but the pain came precisely from the fact that, in his heart, it still seemed real. Michael knew he needed to face the situation, but the fear of not knowing how to act kept him paralyzed. He finally returned home late at night, but the loneliness of the place only intensified the emptiness he felt. The family photos were still on the furniture, Emily's belongings were scattered around the room, as if nothing had changed. But everything had changed. He picked up one of the photos and looked at it for a long time before throwing it back on the table, feeling a mixture of anger and sadness. The next day, he decided to see Emily. When he arrived at the house where they had lived together, he found her sitting on the sofa, her eyes swollen and her hands clasped in her lap. She stood up as soon as she saw him, but he raised his hand, asking her not to come any closer. Emily swallowed and nodded, respecting his space. The boy appeared running across the room, happy to see him, but stopped when he noticed the tense atmosphere. Michael knelt down to hug him, feeling the weight of what that child represented. Emily watched in silence, her eyes fixed on the two of them. Michael finally looked up at her, and the silence was broken by emotionally charged words. She explained everything again, this time more calmly, detailing how her lover manipulated her and used her vulnerability against her. She talked about the threats, about how she felt there was no way out and about the fear of destroying the family they had built. Michael listened without interrupting, trying to process each word, but the hurt was still beating too strong to be ignored. He finally asked her why she never trusted him, why she thought she had to face everything alone. Emily hesitated before answering, saying she didn't know how to tell him, that she was afraid he would abandon her if he knew the truth. Michael was silent for a long time before responding that what had really destroyed everything was the lie, not the truth. Emily broke down in tears, saying she would do anything to make things right, but Michael knew some things couldn't be fixed. He felt the weight of the decision he needed to make, torn between the love he still felt for her and the pain of betrayal. The boy returned to the room, interrupting the tense moment, and Michael realized that, regardless of what happened between him and Emily, that boy would still be part of his life. Emily watched him with a mix of hope and fear as he stood up and walked to the door. She asked if he would be back, but Michael didn't respond. He left without looking back, feeling heavy in his heart, but determined not to make any hasty decisions. In the following days, he immersed himself in work, trying to find some distraction, but the pain was still present. He spent hours reflecting on everything, remembering every conversation, every broken promise. Emily kept calling and sending messages, but he ignored most of them, needing space to process everything. When he finally decided to see her again, it was because he realized he needed to close that chapter somehow. He found Emily calmer, but still clearly shaken. She asked for one last chance to explain, but Michael interrupted, saying he didn't want any more excuses. He needed to know if she was willing to accept the consequences of the choices she made. Emily nodded, saying she would do anything to make amends for what she had caused. Michael looked at her for a long moment before saying that he still didn't know if he could forgive her, but that he wouldn't let the boy suffer because of their mistakes. Emily cried, thanking her for the chance to try to rebuild something, even if it was just for the child's sake. As he left the house once again, Michael felt the weight of the moral dilemma he faced. He knew that the love he felt for Emily was still there, but he also knew that the trust had been destroyed. The decision about their future still hung in the air, and he wondered if he would be able to move on or if the scars from that moment would mark them forever. Michael returned home that night feeling the weight of every decision he had made up to that point. The silence of the place seemed to amplify the voices in her mind, repeating every word Emily said, every revelation that turned her life upside down. He looked at the walls, at the family photos that were still there, and felt his heart sink. Part of him wanted to rip them out, erase all traces of that life that now seemed like a lie, but another part couldn't. It wasn't easy to leave behind years of history, years of love and trust that had been destroyed in a matter of weeks. He spent the night awake, pacing the house and trying to find some clarity amidst the chaos. As the sun began to rise, Michael finally made the decision he had been putting off. He called Emily and asked her to meet him at the park where they used to go with their son. She arrived shortly after, looking exhausted, her eyes red and sunken. She sat on the bench next to him, but kept her distance, respecting the space he seemed to demand. Michael began to speak bluntly, saying he could no longer continue the marriage. Emily listened in silence, tears streaming down her face, but she didn't try to interrupt him. He explained that even though he still had feelings for her, he couldn't trust her anymore, and without trust there was no way to move forward. Emily finally spoke, saying she understood but begging him to stay in her son's life. Michael assured that he would never abandon the boy, regardless of how things between them ended. She thanked him, but the pain in her eyes was evident. Michael knew that conversation was necessary, but that didn't make it any easier. They said goodbye there, and as Emily walked away, he felt an emptiness come over him. As difficult as it was, I knew I was doing the right thing. In the following months, Michael reorganized his life. He sold the house where they lived and moved to a smaller apartment, taking only the essentials. Emily had custody of her son, but Michael remained a constant presence, participating in every important moment in his life. The boy didn't fully understand what had happened, but Michael tried hard to maintain the connection and show that nothing would change between them. Emily, on the other hand, faced difficulties. The public humiliation at the party cost him the respect of many co-workers, and although he kept his job, the atmosphere was never the same. She tried to move on, but guilt and shame were constant companions. She sought therapy to deal with the traumas of her past and the mistakes she had made, but she knew it would take time to forgive herself. The lover, in turn, faced legal consequences for his actions. Arrested for extortion and fraud, he saw his life quickly fall apart. His wife filed for divorce and took the children away, cutting all ties. He spent months in prison awaiting trial, without friends or support, and his shattered reputation made it impossible to rebuild his life after his release. Michael, despite still carrying emotional scars, began to open up to new possibilities. He met someone through work, a woman with an equally complicated past, but who understood him in a way he didn't expect. Little by little, he began to trust again, even with the lingering fear of being hurt. Emily continued to fight to redeem herself, dedicating herself to being the best mother she could and trying to rebuild her life in an honest way. Although she kept in touch with Michael for her son's sake, she knew she would never get his love back. It made her cry at night, but it also pushed her to become a better person. Michael realized, over time, that some pain never completely disappears, but we learn to carry it. He found strength in new relationships and hope for a better future, but he also knew that the betrayal had left deep marks that would shape who he would be from now on. As he watched his son grow up, Michael promised himself he would do everything differently. He would be an example of integrity and honesty, teaching values that he hoped the boy would carry throughout his life. He knew that the past could not be erased, but he believed that the future could still be written with new stories. Life went on for each of them, marked by scars, learning and regrets. Emily continued to face the ghosts of her choices, Michael moved on, learning to love again, and his lover paid the highest price for his manipulations. Each person's fate was sealed by the decisions they made, showing that, although forgiveness is possible, it is not always enough to erase past mistakes. Comment below what you thought of this story and share your opinion about the characters' decisions. Would you have done anything different? Don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more stories like this. Remember, this channel does not support any type of cheating. Loyalty and respect are essential in any relationship. Thanks for following us and see you in the next story.